I've got worms. That may seem to you that I'm sort of oversharing, but it's true, I have got worms. I've got millions of worms. You see, I study worms. Yeah, I can feel the pity rising from the seats. Don't feel sorry for me. I work on one of the most fundamental questions in biology. I study how genes build a living organism from scratch. Admittedly, the organism is a worm, but hey. We use genetics to study genes. And genetics works by breaking genes. We break genes and then see what happens to the organism which has the broken genes, which in my case is a worm. Now, I'm okay with genetics, lots of people aren't. I do have slight twinges when I do genetics, but that's largely because when I chose my career in genetics, I was reading Lord of the Rings. Now, I don't know whether you know the bit, it's sort of blazoned on my brain. There's a scene where Gandalf the Grey, got to get it right, he goes to see his mate. He goes to see Saruman the White. Now, Saruman the White is having something of a sort of wizard's midlife crisis. He no longer wants to be called Saruman the White, he wants to be called Saruman the Colourful. Now, he explains this to Gandalf quite explicitly, and he says, well, white light, if it's broken into its component parts, is made of colours, it's colourful, so that makes sense. Gandalf doesn't like this though. Gandalf is having absolutely none of it, and he says very sternly, he who has to take something apart and break it in order to find out what it is, has left the path of wisdom. Yeah, you can see where this is going. That's sort of what we do with genetics. And so I had a bit of a crisis. And I thought long and hard about this. And I decided that I needed to get a life. So I decided that I would devote my life to studying worms. And I'm okay with that, really. Except at parties. I tried not to mention the worms at parties. It tends to kill the conversation and everybody feels awkward. There's always somebody there as well who sort of tries to gloss over it, tries to make me feel better and says, oh, worms, yeah, they're really interesting, the soil and things. You know, they start losing it a bit, and then they latch onto something and they say, worms, yes, if you cut them in half, isn't it true, if you cut them in half, the two halves will generate each a whole new worm? And I look at them and I say, I don't know, I don't work on those sorts of worms. You see, the worms I work on are called Caenorhabditis elegans. Mm-hmm. It's Latin, but I'm not sure what for. But largely because every time when I first heard it, I thought, it sounds Welsh. So I think of these worms as Welsh. I look down the microscope at them, and I think, look, there's Gwyneth. There's Charisse. Is it Charisse? Never remember how to pronounce that. That one's Stacey. You see, they're all girls, my worms. Okay? There's no Gareths, there are no Reeses, or very few. See, C. elegans doesn't need males to reproduce. So the females do this really neat trick, where for a while they change sexes. They become males, and as males, of course, they make sperm. And then rather revoltingly, they store their sperm away and save it. And then they switch and become female and use that sperm, which they've unsavourily stored somewhere, to fertilise their eggs. This means that they essentially produce copies of themselves. And they don't just produce one, they can produce in 3 days 300 copies. Okay? Now, obviously I spend a lot of time on my own. And I often think, wouldn't that be a really useful thing if humans could do that? But how would that happen? Well, you'd need some sort of, it would be like a superhero power, so you'd acquire it through some sort of weird worm DNA genetic interaction incident. And you're all thinking, well, that's incredibly far-fetched. But actually, a few years ago, such an accident actually befell me. I accidentally stabbed my thigh with a glass needle carrying worm DNA. Sadly, there were no transformations that happened, but just imagine if they had. Just imagine if after having done that, my gonads were gradually transformed and given the reproductive capabilities of worm gonads. Every 3 days, I'd make 300 copies of myself. Now, we don't need to wonder which particular orifice those copies would emerge from. But what an incredible superpower. How would I use this superpower? Well, what I thought was that I could take these 300 copies and get them to write 300 grants. Because I'm bound to be successful with that sort of hit rate. And then those 300 people could then go away and do research for me. Meanwhile, I can swan around, going to conferences on the fruits of these people's labour. Now, I can imagine there's one or two problems associated with this. The first one being, of course, if they're exact copies of me, then they're going to make 300 copies of themselves as well, which are obviously copies of me. So after 3 days, there's now 90,000 copies of me. After another 3 days, there's 27 million. And just shy of a fortnight, there's 8.1 billion. So I've essentially more than doubled the world's population single-handedly. I suspect somebody might notice what was going on. So, some of you might have noticed that having established that with this superpower, I could create an almost limitless army of copies of myself. I mean, the powers for world domination are unimaginable, right? But obviously what I decided I'd fantasize about would be becoming just a better worm geneticist, just more successful, and certainly not rich. Now, some of you, the charitable ones, will be saying, well, that's good. That shows you're happy with your chosen path in life. You don't want for anything else. That's good. You should be pleased with yourself. The less charitable ones will probably say, yeah, well, that just shows you're the sad, nerdy loser that we thought you were. Thank you. But actually, this little exercise has helped me. It's helped me overcome something that I've been living with for years, because I think I've finally resolved the issue that I have with Gandalf. Because being faced with the possibility of becoming an evil genius and taking over the world, I actually took the less devious and evil path. And I think of that, Gandalf would certainly be proud. Thank you.